Welcome everybody to another episode of the JewishDream.com podcast and video show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm really stoked today. We have Alieza Salzberg joining us today. So thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Hey.
Absolutely. All right. So Alieza here, you probably want to know, who is she? She teaches at the International School at Hebrew University and other yeshivot in Jerusalem. She has studied Talmud at Chovei Torah. You did? Really? Okay, cool.
Before you.
Yeah, wow. Chovei Torah, Drisha, Matan, and just last year completed her master's degree at Hebrew University in Midrash and Agadah. Her thesis deals with the relationship between law and narrative in Masechet Ketubot, specifically on the topic of virginity. And it should be noted that a big section involves women and wine. So that, of course, brings us closer to our topic of conversation today. This story that comes up in Berakhot 51b, someone actually pointed out to me when it got hit with Daf Yomi, and so I started looking into it, and I started looking around for it, and I came across Alieza's essay in this book, Reconstructing the Talmud, which was co-edited by a guest on this show, Joshua Culp, and I found her essay. I'm like, we got to have a conversation about this, because this is such a it's a shocking episode, really, in the Babylonian Talmud, and certainly I'm just going to put it out there. If anybody out there has a sensitivity to broken and wasted wine, I'm just just putting that alert out there. It's going to be a very tragic episode for people who hate to see wine wasted or good liquor of any sort. So, and people might be sensitive. Viewers and listeners to JewishDream.com might care, very much about never seeing wine go to waste. So this is a shocking story. And do you want to read it? Do you want me to read it?
You can read it, but I would just say, as another precursor, is that as a young woman studying Talmud way back from the beginning, this is one of the stories, not a tragic story from as a young Talmud student, where finally a woman is one of the main characters. And the drama is very much around, for me, her role in the story, which
it's differently centered. I'm worried about all that wine going to waste. So it's like, for me, I'm telling you, I walk away from that story and I'm just shaking. I'm like, how much wine was wasted? So that's my sadness. Okay. All right. So let's roll with it. So Berakhot 51b. So Ula happened to be at the house of Rav Nachman. So they ate bread, they recited grace after meals, and they gave the cup of blessing to Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman said, okay, now please send this cup. Lishadar Mar Casa de Virchasa Yalta. Please send this cup of blessing to Yalta. Ula responds back to him and says, actually, Rabbi Yochanan says, the fruit of a woman's body is blessed only from the fruit of a man's body, as it is stated from this verse in Deuteronomy 7:13, and he will bless the fruit of your body. And so so basically, Ula is not going to send this cup of blessing to Yalta. Yalta hears this. She gets up. She is really more than not happy. She is enraged. She goes into the wine storage, right? So she goes to the Bechamra. She goes to the wine house. It's a whole house of wine. And then she breaks 400 jugs of wine. Terribly tragic. I've read this story and I was like shaking. I was so upset. So then Rav Nachman says, when she returns, you know what, let's just send another cup to her. Ula then said, all the wine that was in this barrel it counts for the blessing. Basically, you just broke 400 jugs of wine. That's plenty of wine to count. And then she responded in a very sharp way, and this is how the story concludes, from itinerant words and from rags come lice. There's a lot here, and this is the text around which this entire episode we're concerning ourselves with. So there's a lot. I'm not really sure where to start, but I am going to first put out it's interesting. It's not really clear what the relationship is between Yalta and Rav Nachman. Okay, I'm just going to throw this piece in there. There were Tal Ilan in 1997 and Rachel Adler in 1998. So in the late 90s, a couple of scholars really question whether Yalta was actually Rav Nachman's wife. So we have, for instance, a couple of comments of Rashi and a few places in the Talmud that Yalta was Rav Nachman's wife. That's what she's doing there. I think I'm just going to put that on the table, and we're going to come back to that.
Okay.
Or should we just, I'm just going to put it out
We
there.
can talk about it.
All right, let's talk about it. So Yalta, she is not some insignificant lady of the Talmud. She actually is the most frequently appearing woman in the Talmud. And she's mentioned 7 times by name. Let me put it that. She's mentioned by name 7 times.
All 7 times are by name?
What?
Are all 7 times mentioned by name?
7 times by name, and definitely, yes. You have more?
I think that part of the reason why there's a question about whether she is in fact Rav Nachman's wife is because there's some sources where she is mentioned as the daughter of the exilarch. There are other texts where Rav Nachman does things for his wife, who is the daughter of the exilarch. So those are 2 texts which make it sound like she's the same person. And then there's this text where they're sitting at the same table together. There's maybe 2 texts like this where they seem to be in intimate conversation or close quarters. But I'm not sure if her name is in all 6 of those stories. I'd have to check it.
All right, so let's go to the text. Ready?
But I will say that the reason why Tali Lan and Rachel Adler are curious about it is because we're looking for these, women who can represent something for women of that time. And there are very, very few women who are mentioned by name or do anything dramatic enough to make it into the Talmud.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's also a possibility that there's several sort of instances of a woman showing up on the rabbinic radar, and they're intertwined to build up this one character who represents, maybe several different moments of women making a splash.
Like a composite character?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you ready? Here they are. These are the specifically mentioning of Yalta instances.
Okay.
One is Beitza and 25b. That is where, I'll just mention what they are. So here is normally someone should not be carried on the shoulders, right? Poles on a chair borne by poles on a festival. But Rav Nachman permitted Yalta because Yalta is different. Somehow, she's afraid. Okay. Then there's Shabbat 54b, where something to do with Rav Nachman sort of making a joke about Yalta as far as giving birth. Okay. Again, not mentioning as wife. There's Gittin 67b, where she did some interesting thing with the bathhouse and coins and wine. There's Nida 25b, where Yalta does this Yalta's ruse, if anybody's read the menstrual impurity book. Or yes? Menstrual purity? The Charlotte von Robert book, right? All right, yeah. So Nida 25b, she basically does sock shopping. She brings.
That's probably the most important text to contrast to this one, because there she is part of the halachic discussion. She seems to know enough to go from rabbi to ask and to also argue for the halachic answer she's looking for. And I think in contrast to what she does here, which is she's angry, she doesn't speak, she doesn't argue, she doesn't get involved in how did you interpret this pasuk? I would interpret it differently. And so there she sort of represents someone who is smart enough and willing to engage in the halachic process. And here she's sort of circumventing the halachic process by just showing her rage in the most dramatic way.
Oh, right. But in the Shabbat 20b or Nida 20b, she's working within the system to get the results that she wants. And kind of similarly with that earlier one, where sitting on the chair borne by poles on a yontif, that she gets Rav Nachman to permit her to do that, even though that's not really how people behave, right? So there's that. We have Kedushin 70a, which is really fast. That's an interesting one, which we'll get back to. And then we have Chulin 109b, which is a really fascinating one, which I think really demonstrates Yalta's knowledge, really. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but she says to Rav Nachman that everything that the Merciful One prohibited to us, he permitted us a similar item, and then she goes in detail. Okay, so that's it.
Well, that also has to do with trying to work within. There she's sort of making her own explanation for why she should be able to drink milk that's part of a she's looking for a way to eat milk and meat together. And she's saying there's got to be, if I have a taiva for this, if I have a desire for this, there's got to be some kind of other version which will enable me to fulfill this desire. And that, I think the argument is that an udder that has milk within it, is that what it is? Something like that?
Yes.
Is allowed, or maybe it's a...
Yeah, the fat of domestic brain of shubuta, root to tongue of fish. Upon hearing this, Nachman said to his cooks, roast udders on a spit for her. Yeah, she says, I wish to eat a dish that tastes like meat cooked in milk.
Yeah, so if you kill an animal that already has milk within the udder, then you could cook that udder. And that's the one exception. So they're also, like the Shabbat one, she's trying to get an exception to the rule, but trying to do it from within the system, more or less. Yeah. And she's very verbal and talking, as if she's on even footing with the rabbis and trying to get the answer she's looking for.
Yeah. I will say the one time it's kind of confusing and it could possibly point up and sort of mention that Yalta is Rav Nachman's wife is that Kedushin 70a, 70b, where Rav Yehuda stops by and is basically stopped by Rav Nachman's house. And there's this whole thing about, let the master send greetings and peace to Yalta, not to my wife. And then Rav Yehuda said, no, a woman's voice is nakedness. And then eventually, this is what Shmuel says, anyways, it does mention later on his wife. Okay? Now, the whole reason that I bring all of this up, did you want to say something?
Well, I think in this story, the fact that they're sitting together with Ula, I should say, I think that this story is one of the cases that also supports the fact that they're potentially married, because potentially, definitely does not say it explicitly, but the part of the text that we skipped, which is the context, the legal context for the story itself, talks about what you're supposed to do with this cup of wine that you do Birkat HaMazon, that you use in the ritual of Birkat HaMazon. And it says explicitly you should pass it to the members of the household, bitehu. And essentially, the household, the bayit, is often a nickname for one's wife. And so the context, that part of the context, and also the midrash that he's playing with it, Ula's playing with, on the fertility, that the man of the household makes a bracha over a cup of wine and then passes it to the members of his house so that they can also have the blessing of fertility. I do think that there's more reason, again, not because it's explicit, but more reason from the content of the story to assume that they might be married.
So now I want to entertain, basically, in looking at the story, I want to look at it through the eyes of both possibilities. Both that she's his wife and also that she is not, I don't know if you could say a colleague, but certainly like friends-ish, right? And
right,
I think,
and she's the daughter. I think she's the daughter of the Exilarch, so she is wealthy. At least there's one other text where that makes it clear, and also the one on Shabbat about her being carried on the
poles, and the chair on the poles.
There's an element in a few of the stories that she is sort of similar to the Matrona, similar to these Greek Roman women who appear in stories as someone who is sitting at the table, part of the conversation, sometimes pushing buttons of the men at the table, who think that we're questioning whether she belongs there or not.
Right. So I think it's pretty clear that Rav Nachman is married to the daughter of the Exilarch, but it's not clear what Yalta's, right? We don't know that Yalta per se is necessarily the daughter of the Exilarch. How about that?
I have this memory that there's two separate texts.
Okay. But I want to play with we could have two alternative timelines going on. One is that Yalta is indeed Rav Nachman's wife, and the other that she's just a friend, right? So it could be when we come back to our story on Berakhot 51b that part of the sort of her rage, as it were, was you would assume that I'm his wife, like I should be sent the koshel bracha, I should get the blessing cup because I'm my own person. I'm not actually related. I'm just a friend of his. You just assume that all women are, married to men. Mm-hmm. That's one reading. The other, of course, is that she is indeed just you know, she's not just a person on her own, but that she is, as most people and Rashi would say, his wife. And of course, she's still upset. She should get the cup of blessing. And I think that's ultimately how the whole story turns out. Rav Nachman thinks, yeah, that should happen. Ula, who, by the way, I'm just going to point this out, it's on Shabbat 62a. Not that it's a significant difference, but he does make a distinction, a gender distinction between men and women in a different context. So this is not out of place for Ula to be making a gender distinction, a differentiation. So I think still she is not happy, right? Yalta is definitely not happy.
The other element I'd throw in about Ula is that he lives in Israel. And I think that the people who he quotes to support his opinion about how you're supposed to read the pasuk about the blessing are also Israeli rabbis. And he's known as a nechute. He's known as someone who leaves Israel to come to Bavel to sort of preach the appropriate way of reading texts that he brings with him from Israel. And here he shows up at Rav Nachman's house, who is an esteemed judge, and maybe possibly Yalta is the daughter of the Exilarch, and so they both represent Bavel and the sort of superiority or the at least confidence of Bavel versus Israel. And so he comes in, and they're both defending their turf. So whether you see Yalta as defending Bavel because one way of looking at it, or she's defending her household because she and Rav Nachman have a certain ritual, and that Rav Nachman agrees, and they have a sort of an expectation that the wine is going to get passed around. Ula is sort of breaking that that ritual, that expectation.
Right. And so I think there's also some money issue. Like Rav Nachman, he's moneyed. Like he's not, I don't feel bad for his like economic situation.
So you don't feel bad for his wine.
So, well, what's interesting, it mentions it's a Bechamra, right? She goes separately to, it's an entire, it's not just like a few shelves, like he's got a lot. And you also, it's not really clear whether when she breaks these 400 jugs, are they a fraction of what he has? Are they are they a majority? Are they all? Or like, it's not really clear how significant it is. Or maybe he still has 2,000.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's like a typological number of a large amount.
So it's funny you should say that, because the appearance of 400 jugs happens 2 other times in the Talmud.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to spoil this. I'm just going to spoil it. Nothing good happens. Once in Bava Metzia 83a, and separately in Berakhot 5b. And I will just simply say that every time we see 400 jugs of wine, all 3 instances, they get broken. So actually, I'll say it really, actually, it shouldn't be. They go bad. I'm sorry. The other 2 cases, all 400 jugs go bad, and here 400 jugs get broken. But in none of those 3 instances in the entirety of the Babylonian Talmud, whenever you see 400 jugs of wine, just know nothing good happens. They get destroyed. No one gets to drink them. So it's just, like you said, it's a typological number, but here it's a bad number.
Yeah, it's like a big loss. Oh,
it is a huge and sizable loss. And I think that's what happens in each of these 3 texts, that it's a huge loss.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what the text is saying. And despite Rav Nachman having an entire Beit Chamra, an entire wine house, and nevertheless, this 400 is significant. Now, he may still have a few here and there left, but that's a lot of wine to lose. Now, also, I know how big are these jugs?
Well, we don't know exactly how big these jugs are. Yeah. The word nagva is actually only appears maybe twice in the entire Gemara. Much more frequently, you have the language of chavit for a wine store, for a jug that's more than just what you would put on a table.
These are Dane de Chamra.
Dane de Chamra. Oh, so there's 2 different ones. The word Nagva comes up when Ula says this wine is in the Nagva, in the pitcher that's on the table, perhaps, is counted for a blessing, and Dane de Chamra is what you have earlier.
So yeah, these 400 Dane de Chamra, these 400 wine jugs, how big are we talking about? Do we know?
I don't think we know because they're not something which appears again frequently in the Talmud. Often we also have chaviyot. The two other sources that you were talking about, they're also dane techamra.
Yeah.
The chaviyot, which is also a storage of wine usually, can be around 25 liters. So it's like a big jerry can. But I'm not sure. That we have to maybe ask an archaeologist. I think, unfortunately, a lot of these texts are also, to understand how big it is, you have to go back to the story. And then from the story, you can say, well, it's in a bei chamra, so it wasn't what was sitting on the table. It was something that was in storage, and it was quite a large amount. And then they work backwards to try to figure out how big it was. I don't know that we have a clear view. What I was going to say is, for your question about whether she's married to Rav Nachman or not, that also makes a big difference, right? Because if they're married and she breaks wine, which belongs to both of them, then that's one kind of statement, perhaps.
Yep.
And she's willing to sort of accept part of this pain on herself, and she's elbowing her own husband. Versus if she's breaking her host's, then that makes a huge difference.
Right.
It's much meaner, perhaps.
Right. So when I read this, I'm like, why would she destroy hundreds of her own jugs in her own wine house? But so that's only if she's married to him. But if she's not, she's just a friend, a guest, then she breaks them. She's trying to make a stand, and she doesn't lose out on that wine.
Right. So, I mean, part of my argument is that the heart of why she's upset has to do with the midrash that Ula brings. So it's less maybe the public ritual or her desire to be part of the part of what's happening ritually at the table, and more to do with this argument over fertility. And then I think if she's having an argument with him, how you read this verse, does fertility come through the husband or straight from God to the woman? Then breaking wine that belongs to her and her husband together is a very different kind of symbol. And then she really is making a statement of, you want my fertility, my wine? Well, then you need to play by my rules. And I'm going to break our wine store, including my fertility and your fertility, sort of in potential, in anger over this reading that the blessing comes from God to the man and not to the woman. And then I think it becomes much more significant. She is willing to lose her wine and her fertility because she's saying, I'm not playing your game. This was something that we could do together, and I'm out in some way.
For me, I just took it as her sending a really huge message, because that is a massive quantity of wine to see destroyed. And of course, if she's not married to him, then she's just being very demonstrative. It's a very demonstrative action. But what you were saying, it's a very interesting, if you really go into the context, what's the whole context of the story about the drasha from Rabbi Yochanan that Ula is bringing, or more broadly, the sugya writ large, it definitely plays into this, like the fertility aspect of the wine.
Right. I mean, if we just look at the pasuk so that we know what we're dealing with, God is basically saying, if you keep the mitzvot, then I will give you a blessing. And you is singular, but it's referring to the entire nation in Deuteronomy 7. And if you do obey these rules and observe them carefully, then the Lord your God will maintain faithfully for you the covenant, and that he made an oath with your fathers. So it's all you singular in the Hebrew. He will favor you and bless you and multiply you. He will bless the issue of your womb and the produce of your soil, your new grain and wine and oil, and the calving of your herd and the lambing of your flock, and so on and so forth. So clearly
wine's involved in it. Wine is involved.
Definitely. But there, when it's talking singular, and it's talking about your herds and your land and your crops, and clearly it's talking about you, the nation, right? Not you, a man, a singular man. But the way that Ula reads it is in the most literal sense. It says, pri bitnecha, it says, I will bless the fruit of your belly, of your womb. And there's a mismatch there, right? We can imagine the herd of the nation, the soil of the nation, but how can we imagine the belly of the nation? Is that a man's fertility, or is it a woman's fertility? And because it's singular and masculine, he understands it almost overly literally to be a blessing that goes straight to the man. and not to the woman. And then he makes sort of an argument, which is both potentially a biological argument at that time, as well as a spiritual argument, which is that God is blessing the men of the nation, and that the women are a vehicle, basically, for the man's blessing.
Speaking of which, I like our going backwards thing. I know you push back on me to provide a little bit more context rather than be so laser focused, but the cup of blessing here in its relationship to Berakhot Hamazon, which I think is pretty much the very first time we've ever brought this up on JewishTraining.com about the cup of blessing and Berakhot Hamazon. Hopefully not the last, but definitely the first. What I know you wanted to say something a little bit more, right, about the sugya writ large. Did you want to?
Right. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, one of my interests is in law and narrative. So to what extent is this story here to teach us actually a legal, list of things we're supposed to do when we do Berakhot Hamazon? And it starts with the context here is what you're supposed to do with that cup of wine. You're supposed to lift it up high. You're supposed to make sure that the cup is clean from the inside, from the outside. You're supposed to do some kind of surrounding it or covering it.
Shtifa and haracha, right? The inner washing, the outer washing.
Right? Yeah. And the Gemara, the truth is that while it appears somewhat halachic, this breita that lists all these different things you're supposed to do to the wine, even the context of the sugya starts to get to questions that are not so halachic, questions that have to do with more of how this is an issue of respect. Why make sure the cup is filled all the way to the top? Because you're going to get two kinds of blessings. What are those two kinds of blessings? And maybe it's two directions, like the north and the west. Maybe it's blessing in two worlds, in the world to come and in the current world. And so you sort of get the sense already that Yalta isn't asking to make kiddush. She's not asking to be the one to lead the zimun. Actually, the context here could have been, how many people do you count in a zimun? Is a woman counted or not? Is one of the topics that's asked earlier in this parak. So she's not asking for any of these halachic issues. She's asking for something that's much more symbolic and theological, and maybe even in the realm of custom. But she's not asking the harder questions about could a woman lead benching or could a woman lead.
You're saying there's not a lot at stake. It's not like they're breaking things down to allow her to, right? It's just like, let her have some wine for blessing. Like, are we so stingy about our blessings over wine? Like, right?
Right, but is that, so that to me, that's a really interesting question. Is halacha the thing that is the high stakes? Being able to say kiddush is actually, I think a lot of times we do think being able to say kiddush, well, I mean, that's a dramatic request. That is something that pushes the boundaries of changing the law. Yeah. Whereas, possibly, depending what community you come from. But asking to drink, to take a sip at the end of in theory, that should be way less stakes, right? And yet, because what's really at the heart of this is, do you think that God's blessing comes down only through husbands and not directly to women? The stakes are actually a lot higher when it comes to certain rituals, which have symbolic meaning, even if they don't have the same sort of level of deoraita versus derabbanan or halachic change, but they could have just as much significance in a community.
I will say, it's not clear, by the way, if Rav Nachman even accepts this reading by Rabbi Yochanan from Ula. Like, it almost sounds from the story, of course you could read it two ways. For me, the way I hear this story is Ula says, this is what Rabbi Nachman says, da, 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 and she flips out and she leaves and she busts all those jugs. It could also, that's how I read it, that Rav Nachman doesn't even have a moment to say, like, slow up, let's just send her the cup. It's like boom, boom, like it happens. And then she comes back and he's like, hey, let's send you a cup. Like, I'm sorry, I didn't. Versus if there was time, right? Ula says, hey, actually, Rabbi Yochanan says X, Y, and Z. And Rav Nachman's like, yeah, that sounds cool. Like it's just like, and then she's like, you're not even going to stand up for me. And then boom, she's heading off to the Beit Hamra. So I think that matters how we read the story of like, what's Rav Nachman's role here, right?
Right. I think Rav Nachman knows what's about to happen. Actually, Ruchama Weiss wrote an interesting book about tests that happen at mealtime in general. There's probably a lot of wine stuff involved there too. You should check it out. So all kinds of, moments at a meal where somebody turns to somebody else and says, well, let's hear how you're going to do this Birkat Hamazon, right? Which part are you going to skip, or which part, all kinds of questions where the person asking the question knows full well that they are either testing or pushing the person that they've asked it. So I get the sense that when Rav Nachman asks him to lead and then he says, won't you just pass that cup to Yalta, he knows what he's getting himself into. He knows that he's pushing Ula and he's saying, Ula, are you going to stand up for the tradition in my household, or are you going to stand up, or maybe Bavel, or are you going to quote something that's going to create a conflict here? So I get the sense that Rav Nachman knows what he's getting himself into. And then I think that there's a major contrast between Rav Nachman's coolness, right? When Yalta comes back, she might come back to the table. It's not even clear whether she comes back to the table. But when Rav Nachman says, let's try this again, please pass her the wine, it feels like he is way too cool for what just happened, like cool in the sense of neutral.
He's definitely, for someone who just lost 400 jugs of wine, I wouldn't be so cool.
So I get the sense that you have Ula and Rav Nachman who can debate this on a theoretical level and it doesn't impact them so much. Whereas for, especially as we said, because the halachic stakes are not so high, and for Yalta, it's much more of a emotional issue. And that's why I mentioned before in terms of some of the other stories that she appears in, because I think in most of the other stories, she is part of the system. Sometimes she's manipulating the system a little bit. She's not, doesn't feel like she can just clearly state her halachic position. But she is within the system, and and even manipulating is a kind of coolness, right? A kind of calm, maintaining your calm to get what you want. And this is one of the few stories where she is just overflowing with anger and emotion and passion. She almost appears drunk, right? If we're talking about wine already. And that there's an element there. If one is imagining this even in especially if we say that maybe she's not even married, right? To Rav Nachman. We're imagining some kind of symposium where they've already drunken lots of wine and having this conversation, and she's just too emotional to have it out on their terms with their kind of debate. She just goes and does this action.
Definitely different. That is definitely a different. Once you threw that in, is this cup of blessing, this cup of wine at the end, is that the only wine that they've consumed that entire meal? They just waited till the end, or that's an interesting possibility. Like, hey, if Ula's visiting, he's coming from out of town, and Rav Nachman probably wants to be a good host. He's probably bringing out some more jugs of wine, and so they've, including Yalta, they probably had a few.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think the other sugyot around this one definitely makes it clear that you've already had several cups of wine, but you distinguish and have another cup for your benching.
Yeah.
So it's a separate issue. If we're talking about law versus narrative, or halachic issues versus symbolic theological issues, Ula says, halachically, okay, you want to drink the wine, I give in. But he's really not giving her the respect that she deserves. And she can sense that, I think. And her ending, when she says, gossip comes from peddlers and vermin from rags, she seems to be saying, I don't trust you, right? She's not even talking again about the topic itself, but just, you're someone who travels from Israel to Bavel, you're trying to pass off your wares, you're trying to sell us your truth from Israel, and but you're just a peddler, and you're just maybe smelly from the road, and I don't trust what you're saying.
Right. So I have two things. One is the meta thing, and the other is the little piece, which is he comes off as a jerk. Like, even in this story, Ula clearly comes off as a jerk, unquestionably, and he's not even really that apologetic. And she gets a good dig in, like, in as much as anybody can be upset about the 400 jugs of wine, which I'm still shocked about, but she does give a good dig at the end. And what's really fascinating about the language she uses is, as you mentioned, he's one of the nichlotai, so he's bringing things back and forth, he's traveling, he's bringing his wares, but his wares should be something that are valuable, that are like gems, that are precious as wine, and yet she says they're as precious as lice or rags, right? So the value of what he's bringing around is, and I think it largely has to do with who is bringing it. It's not necessarily, although to some degree it is, what they're bringing around, but it's really who and the quality of and what they bring around. And so she's saying, we expect that you have this high quality of stuff, but it turns out your own characteristics, your own quality is really lacking.
Right. You could be a merchant or you could be a peddler, and I think that that's part of the dig that she's that she's giving to him.
Of course.
Right. And as a feminist reading it, and let's say when I first saw this, years and years ago, as a young woman looking for the Gemara for role models, for texts of protest that have potential for change. I have very ambivalent feelings about Yalta in this story specifically, right? On the one hand, she comes across as, damaging property and crossing the line and too angry and passionate to have a straightforward conversation at the table with these men. And on the other hand, it's quite shocking that the Gemara includes a story like this and sort of gives space for women to say, this is not okay, this is not, the status quo is not enough, and to push the boundary. And so I don't know, she's somewhere in this middle space for me, as somebody who represents the possibility that the Gemara could see injustice, that it could see that the system that it had was not perfect. It could see that there were two rabbis who could disagree about things, and create such pain for the women sitting at the table with them. And on the other hand, it's not clear whether they're dismissing her as too crazy or too off the derech, to really make a change. Whereas Rav Nachman, if he decides that it could stay that way, it'll stay that way. Like his, I keep going back to that word cool, but he and Ula can have that ivory tower conversation and discuss which way they're gonna go. Whereas she doesn't feel like her voice is heard unless she really does something dramatic.
Yeah. The story has a certain terseness to it, right? Because we don't really know Rav Nachman's response, and we also don't know if Yalta had actually at the meal spoken up and said, by the way, do you really think that, Ula? Like, is that really, I get that Rabbi Yochanan could think about that verse in that way, but I mean, come on, like, it's our wombs, right? So but we don't have these little interjections, right? We don't see all these moments. We don't know if Rav Nachman said something at that point in time, like, you know what, Ula, just give her the cup, and so it's not clear if there had been some movement made between Ula's statement and her, destructiveness in the wine house.
Right. I mean, perhaps because we've seen her in other texts, you get the sense that she knows what to expect already. I think, I don't know, because in other texts. Because in other texts she talks and she manipulates and she works within the system, and in this one she doesn't. I almost get the sense, again, it might not be the same character, but assuming it is, it seems like she understands what's happening at the table. She knows who Ula is, or she knows she's heard this argument before, and that's part of the reason why she doesn't wait around to see whether Rav Nachman's going to stand up for her or not.
I mean, the sad thing is, you wish if these 400 jugs were Ula's, that he would actually experience some loss. But instead, it's Rav Nachman. But I also there's some interesting, like, socioeconomic stuff going on also, because these 400 jugs, for most people, would be a severe and significant economic setback. Versus here, it doesn't sound like he really, he's got money, he's all right. Like, yeah, this is a loss that I think for most people in any time and place, it doesn't matter where or when, like 400 jugs of wine is a lot. But even he is like, okay, like I'll get more wine. And so it's something that I think for most people, when they see her or hear of her doing this epic action, it would be incredibly crippling. But for Rav Nachman, he gets the message, right? It's a significant act, but he gets the message, and ultimately Ulla comes off as a jerk. She seems to be somewhat justified, and Rav Nachman will have more wine. You know, like you don't have a lot of pity ultimately at the end of the day for Rav Nachman.
Right.
I do want to say one thing, which we hadn't really talked about. I want to say one more thing, which is I know other people have written about this, about her line to Ulla is kind of like a reconstruction of something from Ben Sira, which was really talking about how women sort of peddle in lies, right? And so she reconstitutes it in a way that it's not negative about women, but negative about these lice-filled peddlers, right? And so she's like throwing it back at him in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I also think that last line reminds me of the mistaken idea of spontaneous regeneration. That they used to think that, if you have rags on the floor, you have rotting meat on the floor, and then you see maggots on it the next day, that the meat itself produced the flies. And I think that there's a possibility that she's making the argument here too, somehow dealing in false understandings of fertility. And she's saying, essentially, you're wrong. Fertility, a woman's body is not just a vessel for, male seed, but rather there's something that happens. There's fertility that comes from the woman herself. This is a little bit more of a stretch. I don't know. But I do think what I do know about Greco-Roman medicine is that there is an ongoing debate about whether there's a two-seed model and that there's some kind of mixing of male and female seed, or whether there is the woman is the vessel and the man's seed is just
what makes it happen,
nourishing from the woman. And so it's possible that that's also part of what's going on here, that what he is peddling, the lies that he's peddling, also is a misunderstanding of biology, and so therefore also fertility.
That's interesting. That's an interesting twist. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching on this episode about a particular episode that happened hundreds of years ago with many broken jugs of wine, and involving Yalta, Ulla, and Rav Nachman. And I want to thank so much Alieza Salzberg for joining us today. Thank you, Alieza.
My pleasure.
Awesome. All right. What?
It was great talking about it.
It was. Thank you so much, and l'chaim, everybody.
L'chaim.